Around midday on December 22, 1944, General der Panzertruppen Heinrich von Lüttwitz stood in a farmhouse command post west of Bastogne, Belgium, studying a map that showed something impossible. The map showed American positions that should not exist. 3 days earlier, von Lüttwitz commanded the 47th Panzer Corps, spearheading the southern thrust of Germany's Ardennes offensive. His forces had surrounded the American 101st Airborne Division in Bastogne. The town was critical. 7 roads converged there. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled movement through the Ardennes. Von Lüttwitz had 15,000 soldiers, 45 tanks, and complete encirclement. The Americans inside had maybe 6,000 men, limited ammunition, no armor support, and no clear path for reinforcement. Von Lüttwitz had already sent surrender demands. The American commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, had replied with a single word: nuts. Von Lüttwitz expected Bastogne to fall within 48 hours. Standard military doctrine said surrounded forces without reinforcement or resupply would collapse within 2 to 3 days. The Americans were low on ammunition, medical supplies, and food. Winter weather prevented air resupply. The situation was tactically hopeless. But the map showed American Third Army units approaching from the south, moving faster than should be physically possible. The Third Army had been fighting more than 150 kilometers away near the German border, engaged in heavy offensive operations around Saarbrücken. Military doctrine said an army engaged in offensive operations needed minimum 1 to 2 weeks to disengage, reorient 90 degrees, and mount a counteroffensive through winter terrain. Von Lüttwitz had studied logistics his entire career. He knew what armies could and could not do. What the map showed violated every principle of military movement he understood. The Third Army was commanded by Lieutenant General George Smith Patton, Jr., and von Lüttwitz was beginning to understand why other German commanders had warned him about this particular American general. The first German officer von Lüttwitz knew who had fought Patton was General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the Panzer Lehr Division. Von Lüttwitz had served with Bayerlein in North Africa and Russia. They were friends, had trained at the same Kriegsschule, and understood armored warfare the same way. In August 1944, Bayerlein's Panzer Lehr Division was one of Germany's elite formations. Full strength, experienced crews, the best equipment Germany could produce. The division had fought across France since D-Day, conducting the kind of mobile defense that German doctrine prescribed. Trade space for time, make the enemy pay for every kilometer, preserve combat power, withdraw to prepared positions, fight from strength. Bayerlein's division faced Patton's Third Army during the Das Epinal breakout from Normandy. On July 25, 1944, American forces launched Operation Cobra, the breakout offensive south of St. Lo. Bayerlein positioned the Panzer Lehr Division to conduct a mobile defense along predicted American axes of advance. German doctrine said American forces would advance methodically, consolidate gains, secure supply lines, and advance again. Predictable, controllable. Bayerlein prepared defensive positions in depth, planned withdrawal routes, and positioned reserves to counterattack American penetrations. Everything by doctrine, everything correct. Patton's forces ignored the doctrine. On August 1, 1944, American Third Army elements penetrated German lines near Avranches. Standard procedure said they would consolidate, bring up supplies, prepare for the next phase. Instead, they kept moving. On August 2nd, they were 30 kilometers deeper. On August 3rd, 40 kilometers. By August 4th, American armored columns were 60 kilometers behind where German intelligence said they should be. Bayerlein's carefully prepared defensive positions were bypassed. His planned withdrawal routes were cut. His reserve forces were isolated. Within 72 hours, the Panzer Lehr Division was combat ineffective. Not destroyed by firepower, destroyed by movement. The Americans had moved faster than the Germans could react. Bayerlein later told von Lüttwitz that fighting Patton felt like fighting a completely different army than the one he had faced under other American commanders. The British, under Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, advanced methodically, predictably, following doctrine. The Americans under Lieutenant General Omar Bradley advanced carefully, securing flanks, maintaining supply lines. Both were competent, professional, dangerous, but predictable. German defensive doctrine worked against them. Trade space for time, make them fight for ground, inflict casualties, withdraw before encirclement, preserve combat power. German commanders could anticipate their movements, prepare defenses, and execute withdrawals with acceptable losses. Patton did not allow that. His forces moved at speeds German doctrine said were impossible. They bypassed strong points instead of reducing them. They cut supply lines instead of pushing frontally. They appeared in places German intelligence said they could not reach, and they did it faster than German forces could reposition to counter them. Bayerlein said it felt like fighting an opponent who ignored the rules both sides had agreed to follow. By mid-August 1944, the Panzer Lehr Division had been reduced from 15,000 men and 200 armored vehicles to maybe 4,000 men and 30 operational tanks, not through direct combat, through collapse of defensive cohesion caused by operational tempo the Germans could not match. The second officer von Lüttwitz heard from was General der Panzertruppen Walter Kruger, commander of the 58th Panzer Corps. Kruger had fought in Poland, France, and Russia. He was a professional, experienced in mobile warfare, and understood how armored operations worked. In September 1944, Kruger's corps defended the Moselle River line in eastern France. The Moselle was a formidable defensive obstacle. Wide river, limited crossing points, high ground on the eastern bank. German forces held prepared positions with clear fields of fire. Standard defensive doctrine said an attacking force needed 3-to-1 superiority to force a river crossing. Patton's Third Army had maybe 2-to-1 superiority in most sectors, sometimes less. Military planning said Patton would need to concentrate forces, conduct reconnaissance, prepare crossing sites, mass artillery, and execute a deliberate assault. That process required time, days, maybe a week. On September 5th, 1944, American forces from Third Army's 12th Corps reached the Moselle River near Nancy. On September 6th, they were crossing. Not after days of preparation, immediately. Kruger's defensive positions were sound. His troops were experienced. His artillery was registered on the crossing sites. But American forces crossed in multiple locations simultaneously, using assault boats, improvised rafts, captured German equipment, and in some cases swimming. They did not wait for bridging equipment. They did not mass forces at single crossing points. They crossed wherever they found an opportunity and established bridging operations under fire. German doctrine said this should result in piecemeal attacks that could be defeated in detail. Instead, it created multiple penetrations, faster than German reserves could respond. By September 8th, American forces had 3 bridgeheads across the Moselle. By September 10th, they had established pontoon bridges and were moving armor across. Kruger's defensive line, which should have held for weeks, collapsed in 5 days. He later wrote in his after-action report that Patton's forces seemed to operate on different planning timelines than other Allied commanders. Where Montgomery might take 3 weeks to plan and execute a river crossing, Patton took 3 days. Where Bradley might wait for optimal conditions, Patton attacked immediately and created favorable conditions through speed and surprise. Kruger noted that German defensive doctrine assumed time to react, time to reposition reserves, time to organize counterattacks. Patton did not give that time. Von Lüttwitz heard similar reports from commanders across the Western Front. General der Infanterie Baptist Knies, commanding the 85th Infantry Corps in Lorraine, reported that American Third Army units advanced at rates that exceeded German intelligence estimates by factors of 2 or 3. General der Infanterie Hans von Obstfelder, commanding the First Army in Alsace, reported that his defensive planning timelines were consistently wrong because Patton's forces arrived days before German staff projections said they could. The pattern was consistent across every sector where Patton's Third Army operated. German defensive doctrine, which worked effectively against other Allied commanders, failed against Patton, and German officers were struggling to understand why. Von Lüttwitz studied the problem systematically. He was a staff officer by training, had served in the operations section of Army Group Center in Russia, and understood military planning. He knew how modern armies functioned. Logistics determined operational tempo. An army moved at the speed its supply system could sustain. Fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts had to flow from rear depots to front line units. That flow had physical limits, determined by truck capacity, road networks, and organizational efficiency. Von Lüttwitz calculated that an American armored division required approximately 300 tons of supplies daily to maintain offensive operations. That supply load had to move through a logistics chain extending back to ports in Normandy, a distance of 300 to 400 kilometers by late summer 1944. The math was straightforward. Trucks could move maybe 200 kilometers per day on decent roads. Loading and unloading added time. Maintenance reduced available vehicles. Weather impacted everything. Based on these constraints, von Lüttwitz estimated that American forces should advance approximately 20 to 25 kilometers per day during sustained offensive operations. That was the physical limit the logistics system could support. But Patton's Third Army was advancing 40 to 50 kilometers per day in some sectors, sometimes more. Von Lüttwitz checked his calculations repeatedly. The numbers did not make sense. Either American logistics were dramatically more efficient than German intelligence estimated, or Patton was operating his army in ways that violated standard logistics doctrine. Von Lüttwitz suspected the latter. He began reviewing intelligence reports from Sicily, where Patton had commanded the 7th Army in July 1943. The Sicilian campaign provided clear data. German and Italian forces defended the island. The British 8th Army under Montgomery landed on the southern coast and advanced north toward Messina. The American 7th Army under Patton landed on the southern coast and was initially assigned a supporting role protecting Montgomery's left flank. Standard campaign plan. Sound doctrine. The British would take Messina, the German escape route. The Americans would support. Patton ignored the plan. Instead of supporting Montgomery's advance, Patton launched his own drive toward Palermo on Sicily's northern coast, then raced east along the coastal road toward Messina. German intelligence at the time assessed this as tactically unsound. Patton was extending his supply lines, exposing his flanks, and moving away from the main objective. German defensive forces expected him to stall when his logistics collapsed. Patton captured Palermo in 4 days, covered over 300 kilometers in 5 weeks, and beat Montgomery to Messina by several hours. German forces defending Sicily reported that American 7th Army units appeared in their rear areas days before German staff assessments said they could arrive. Unit after unit reported supply dumps overrun, headquarters surprised, defensive positions bypassed. The common theme was speed. Patton moved faster than German planning cycles could accommodate. Major Rudolf Böhmler, who commanded a battalion defending central Sicily, later wrote that American forces under Patton seemed to ignore their own logistical constraints. His intelligence section estimated that American supply lines should collapse after advancing more than 100 kilometers from their beachheads. Instead, American units continued operating effectively at distances exceeding 150 kilometers. Böhmler noted that captured American soldiers reported that their units frequently operated with minimal supply stockage, living day to day on what trucks could deliver, accepting higher risk to maintain operational tempo. German doctrine considered that reckless. You did not outrun your logistics. You maintained supply discipline. You built stockpiles before major operations. Patton apparently considered speed more valuable than supply security. Von Lüttwitz found the pattern repeated in France. In September and October 1944, Third Army advanced across eastern France faster than its supply system should support. After-action reports from multiple German units described American armored columns advancing on reduced fuel allocations, sometimes literally running out of gasoline mid-operation, and resuming movement when supply trucks caught up hours later. German doctrine said you did not advance until you had sufficient supplies to complete the operation. Patton advanced anyway and solved supply problems through movement rather than preparation. The German High Command struggled to develop effective countermeasures. In October 1944, General Oberst Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations Staff at OKW, issued guidance to Western Front commanders on countering American armored operations. The guidance emphasized mobile defense, preservation of combat power, and using interior lines to concentrate against American penetrations. Sound doctrine. The same doctrine that worked against Montgomery in Operation Market Garden. The same doctrine that slowed Bradley's advance through the Hürtgen forest. The doctrine failed against Patton. Third Army's advance through Lorraine in November and December of 1944 demonstrated why. German forces defending Lorraine established defensive positions in depth, organized mobile reserves, and planned counterattacks against expected American penetrations. Textbook defense. Should worked. Instead, Patton's forces attacked simultaneously across multiple sectors, creating penetrations faster than German reserves could respond, bypassing strong points, isolating defensive positions, and forcing German forces into reactive mode where they could not execute planned counterattacks. The 58th Panzer Corps lost 60% of its combat power in 2 weeks, not through direct combat, but through operational collapse caused by losing the initiative. The Lorraine Campaign also revealed the limits of Patton's approach. In September 1944, Third Army reached the fortified city of Metz. The city was surrounded by 43 interconnected forts, built between the 1870s and 1930s. These were not field fortifications. They were permanent concrete and steel structures with deep underground galleries, armored gun turrets, and overlapping fields of fire. Hitler had designated Metz a fortress city, ordering the garrison to resist to the last extremity. The 462nd Volksgrenadier Division defended the city and its fort system with approximately 14,000 German troops. Patton initially believed Metz would fall quickly. His operational style emphasized speed and maneuver. Sieges violated that philosophy. On September 27, 1944, Third Army's 5th Infantry Division launched an assault on Fort Driant, a key position southwest of Metz. The fort was built in 1902, continuously reinforced by French and German armies. It had steel-reinforced concrete walls, a deep dry moat, barbed wire barriers, 5 main gun batteries mounting 150mm guns, and extensive underground facilities. American planners had not conducted ground reconnaissance. They were unaware of the fort's layered defenses. The assault failed badly. American infantry penetrated the outer defenses, but could not advance through the underground tunnel system. German defenders used the tunnels to counterattack from unexpected directions. Tank destroyers proved ineffective against armored pillboxes. Artillery bombardment, including 240mm guns and aerial bombing by P-47 Thunderbolts, caused minimal damage to the fortifications. By October 9th, Patton ordered the attack abandoned. The 5th Infantry Division had suffered significant casualties for no gain. Major General S. Leroy Irwin, division commander, received blame for moving too slowly, though the real problem was that fortified positions required different tactics than mobile warfare. General Omar Bradley, Patton's superior, was frustrated by the Fort Bryant operation. Bradley later recorded confronting Patton, "For God's sake, George, lay off. I promise you'll get your chance. When we get going again, you can far more easily pinch out Metz and take it from behind." Bradley wanted Patton to bypass Metz entirely. Patton insisted on taking it, partly from operational necessity, partly from pride. The disagreement highlighted tension between Patton's aggressive instincts and theater-level strategy. The Metz siege dragged through October and into November. Heavy autumn rains turned the terrain to mud. Supply shortages, particularly fuel, limited operations. Third Army was receiving approximately 200,000 gallons of fuel daily against requirements of 350,000 to 400,000 gallons. The shortages forced Patton to choose which operations to prioritize. German defenders under General Otto von Knobelsdorff conducted effective delaying actions, using the fortifications and terrain to maximum advantage. The 58th Panzer Corps and German First Army forces defending Lorraine were outnumbered and outgunned, but the defensive advantages of the Metz fort system partially offset American material superiority. In mid-November, Third Army finally assembled sufficient resources for a major coordinated assault. On November 8, 1944, two corps attacked simultaneously. 20th Corps under Major General Walton Walker advanced from the north and west against Metz. 12th Corps under Major General Manton Eddy attacked from the south, bypassing Metz to strike toward the Saar River. The coordinated offensive employed tactics learned from the Fort Bryant failure. American forces avoided frontal assaults on fortified positions when possible. They used combined arms operations, coordinating infantry, armor, artillery, and air support. They systematically reduced individual forts, rather than attempting to storm the entire system simultaneously. By late November, American forces had encircled Metz and were reducing the fort system piece by piece. Fort Bryant, which had resisted assault in September and October, finally surrendered on December 8th without requiring another direct attack. The garrison had been isolated and cut off from resupply. When Metz fell on December 13, 1944, approximately 11,000 German prisoners were captured. The siege had lasted over 3 months. Patton's prediction of a quick victory had proven badly wrong. German commanders defending Metz viewed the siege differently than earlier encounters with Third Army. The static defense had worked. Fortifications and prepared positions had negated American mobility advantages. Time and terrain had been on the German side. The defenders inflicted significant American casualties and delayed Third Army's advance by months. German defensive operations executed the fortress city concept effectively. For once, German forces had contained Patton not through mobile operations, but through static defense that forced him to fight the kind of battle where his operational tempo advantages did not apply. However, the Metz siege also demonstrated that even when contained, Patton remained dangerous. Rather than becoming fixated on Metz, he had used 12th Corps to continue, advancing around the city. While 20th Corps besieged Metz, 12th Corps pushed east toward the Saar, maintaining operational momentum. When the German Ardennes offensive began on December 16th, Third Army was not trapped in a siege but positioned to respond rapidly. The Metz operation had consumed significant resources and time, but Patton had prevented it from completely stopping Third Army's operations. He had fought the siege as a holding action while maintaining offensive capability elsewhere in his sector. The Lorraine Campaign revealed important truths about Patton's operational methods. His aggressive style and emphasis on speed were devastating against mobile defensive operations. But against fortified positions that negated mobility, his advantages diminished significantly. The campaign also showed that Patton sometimes allowed pride and competitive instinct to override operational judgment. The Fort Bryant assault should have been abandoned immediately after initial failure. Continuing it wasted resources and casualties for no gain. Bradley had been correct that Metz could be more easily taken from behind. But Patton's insistence on taking it frontally reflected his personality and command philosophy. He believed in maintaining constant pressure, never allowing the enemy respite, even when tactical conditions did not favor his preferred methods. German commanders began recognizing a pattern. Other Allied commanders fought methodically. They concentrated forces, achieved local superiority, reduced German positions systematically, and advanced carefully. That approach was slow, but effective. German forces could trade space for time, inflict casualties, and preserve combat power through managed withdrawals. Patton fought differently. He accepted higher risk, moved faster, and created situations where German defensive doctrine could not function effectively. Speed became its own form of combat power. German forces found themselves constantly reacting, repositioning, withdrawing under pressure, unable to establish defensive coherence. The psychological impact was significant. German soldiers fighting British or other American forces knew what to expect. Methodical advances, artillery preparation, armor infantry combined operations executed by doctrine. Professional, dangerous, but predictable. You could prepare. You could execute defensive plans. You could inflict casualties and withdraw in good order when necessary. Soldiers fighting Patton's Third Army reported different experiences. American forces appeared unexpectedly, attacked from unexpected directions, maintained pressure when German troops expected pauses for consolidation. After-action reports from German units facing Third Army showed higher rates of unit disintegration, unauthorized withdrawals, and command confusion compared to units facing other Allied formations. Not because Third Army had better equipment or training, but because their operational tempo disrupted German command and control cycles. General Major Otto Remer, commanding the Führer-Begleit Brigade, fought against both British and American forces in northwestern Europe. He later stated that fighting Montgomery felt like chess. Calculated moves, predictable patterns, opportunity for counter-moves. Fighting Patton felt like being hit repeatedly before you could respond. Different experience, different psychological pressure. By December 1944, German intelligence had collected significant data on Patton. They knew his biography. Born 1885 in California, West Point graduate, career cavalry officer who transitioned to armor, combat experience in World War I, commanded armored units in North Africa, Sicily, and Northern Europe, known for aggressive tactics, profane personality, and speed of operations. German intelligence also knew his weaknesses. Impulsive, sometimes reckless, politically controversial, had been relieved of command temporarily after striking soldiers. Prone to outrunning logistics, created coordination problems with adjacent units. His aggressiveness sometimes created vulnerabilities. But German commanders facing him found little comfort in those weaknesses. Yes, Patton took risks. Yes, he sometimes created problems. But his speed and aggressiveness created worse problems for German forces trying to defend against him. In the calculus of combat effectiveness, Patton's strengths outweighed his weaknesses when measured by the destruction of German combat power. Senior German commanders recognized this. In November 1944, General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, issued an intelligence assessment to Army Group commanders. The assessment analyzed Allied command personalities and operational patterns. Montgomery was described as methodical, cautious, strong in set-piece operations. Bradley was described as competent, systematic, effective in sustained operations. Patton was described as the most dangerous Allied field commander because of his speed and unpredictability. The assessment noted that German forces could generally anticipate Montgomery's operations days in advance, and Bradley's operations hours in advance. Patton's operations were often detected only after they had begun, leaving inadequate time for effective German response. Von Rundstedt's assessment included a specific warning. If Allied forces launched a major offensive, German defensive success depended on containing it within the first 72 hours. That time window allowed German reserves to reposition, defensive lines to cohere, and operational responses to develop. Montgomery and Bradley typically gave that time through their methodical approach. Patton did not. His forces typically achieved operational depth within 24 to 48 hours, moving inside the German decision cycle. The assessment concluded that containing Patton required either overwhelming defensive strength or attacking him before he could build momentum. Neither option was readily available to German forces in late 1944, which brought von Lüttwitz back to the map on his command post table on December 22, 1944. The map showed Third Army units approaching Bastogne from the south. Days earlier, Patton's army had been engaged in offensive operations more than 150 kilometers away. Patton attended a meeting with Supreme Commander General Dwight Eisenhower on December 19th. Eisenhower asked how quickly Third Army could disengage, turn north, and relieve Bastogne. Patton said 48 hours. Other commanders at the meeting thought he was exaggerating. Von Lüttwitz had read the captured operational order. Third Army staff had prepared 3 contingency plans before the meeting, anticipating orders to counterattack north. The plans outlined movements for 3 divisions, 87,000 soldiers, hundreds of tanks and vehicles, through winter conditions on congested roads. Standard military planning said that operation required minimum 1 week. Patton said 48 hours. On December 22nd, days after the meeting, lead elements of Third Army's 4th Armored Division made contact with German forces south of Bastogne. The main body was hours behind. Von Lüttwitz had fought in Poland, France, Russia, and now the Western Front. He understood military operations. What Patton had accomplished was theoretically possible, but practically absurd. Moving an Army Corps 90 degrees through winter weather required disengaging from current operations, reorganizing columns, coordinating movement routes, managing traffic, distributing new orders, adjusting supply plans, and maintaining unit cohesion. Each step required time. Adding them together meant days, not hours. Patton had compressed that timeline through methods von Lüttwitz could only partially reconstruct from intelligence reports. Third Army staff had pre-planned contingency operations, anticipating the need to respond to German offensive. That was good staff work, but not unique. Most competent staffs prepared contingencies. The difference was execution speed. Patton issued verbal orders immediately, confirmed with written orders later. He accepted risks of coordination problems to gain time. He used multiple movement routes simultaneously, accepting congestion to increase throughput. He prioritized lead combat elements over support units, reversing standard practice of moving logistics forward first. He communicated intent rather than detailed instructions, allowing subordinate commanders to solve problems locally rather than waiting for higher headquarters guidance. Each technique violated standard doctrine. Each technique had risks. Together, they compressed operational timelines by 40 to 60%. Von Lüttwitz studied the effect on his own operational plan. The plan to reduce Bastogne assumed no significant American reinforcement for minimum 1 week, more likely 10 to 14 days. That assumption was based on sound analysis of American logistics and movement capabilities. The assumption was wrong because it was based on how other American commanders operated. Patton operated differently. Now von Lüttwitz faced American reinforcements arriving faster than his plan anticipated. His forces surrounding Bastogne were strong enough to contain the garrison, but not strong enough to simultaneously contain the garrison and fight off relief forces. His division commanders were requesting permission to withdraw before being encircled themselves. The irony was not lost on von Lüttwitz. German forces had encircled Americans in Bastogne. Now Patton's relief forces threatened to encircle the Germans. The tactical situation was reversing faster than German operational planning could accommodate. On December 26, 1944, elements of Third Army's 4th Armored Division broke through German lines and reached Bastogne. The siege was lifted. Von Lüttwitz withdrew his forces to avoid encirclement. The Ardennes offensive, which had aimed to split Allied forces and capture Antwerp, stalled. Not because of weather, not because of supplies, but because Patton had moved faster than German planning assumed possible. German officers who faced Patton during the war and were interviewed afterward consistently identified his speed as his most dangerous characteristic. Not superior tactics or equipment, but operational tempo that prevented German forces from executing defensive doctrine effectively. You could not trade space for time against an opponent who covered space faster than your planning cycle. You could not preserve combat power through managed withdrawals when enemy forces appeared in your rear before you completed the withdrawal. You could not execute operational counterattacks when the operational situation changed hourly rather than daily. Other German commanders expressed similar concerns. General Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring, who commanded German forces in Italy and later in the West, faced Patton's operations during multiple campaigns. Kesselring had fought Montgomery at El Alamein, fought Mark Clark in Italy, and fought multiple Allied commanders in northwestern Europe. German defensive planning against Montgomery and Clark followed predictable patterns. Patton's speed created different challenges. German forces defending against Third Army found themselves constantly reacting rather than executing planned operations. General Oberst Heinz Guderian, architect of German Panzer doctrine and chief of the General Staff in 1944 and 1945, was interrogated by American forces in 1945. When asked about Allied commanders, Guderian stated that from the standpoint of a tank specialist, Patton conducted operations as Guderian himself would have done. This represented significant acknowledgement from the officer who created German armored doctrine. Guderian had created the doctrine Patton used. He recognized that Patton applied that doctrine effectively. Guderian noted that many German panzer commanders still thought in terms of World War I breakthrough operations. Penetrate enemy lines, exploit the breakthrough, achieve operational objectives. Patton thought in terms of dislocation. Move fast enough to disrupt enemy operational coherence, regardless of whether you achieved specific geographic objectives. The geographic objectives became accessible once enemy forces lost coherence. The statistical evidence supported these assessments. In Sicily, July to August 1943, Patton's 7th Army advanced 380 kilometers in 38 days, an average of 10 kilometers per day. Montgomery's 8th Army advanced 150 kilometers in the same period, less than 4 kilometers per day. Both armies faced similar opposition. The difference was operational tempo. In France, August to December 1944, Third Army advanced 600 kilometers from Normandy to the German border, averaging 8 to 10 kilometers per day during active operations. British forces under Montgomery averaged 4 to 5 kilometers per day. American forces under Bradley averaged 5 to 6 kilometers per day. Third Army consistently moved faster. German casualties reflected this. Units facing Third Army suffered higher rates of encirclement, supply disruption, and operational collapse compared to units facing other Allied forces. The German 15th Army, facing Montgomery in northern France and Belgium, lost approximately 40% of its strength from June to December 1944, primarily through direct combat. The German First Army, facing Patton in eastern France, lost approximately 60% of its strength in the same period, with higher proportions lost to encirclement and supply disruption rather than direct combat. The operational method caused different patterns of destruction. Montgomery destroyed German forces through firepower. Patton destroyed them through dislocation and operational collapse. American commanders recognized Patton's effectiveness, but struggled with his methods. General Eisenhower valued Patton's combat record, but found him difficult to manage. Eisenhower's operational plans emphasized coordinated advances, balanced logistics, and mutual support between Army groups. Patton's tendency to outrun logistics and create coordination problems complicated theater-level planning. In September 1944, Eisenhower reduced fuel allocations to Third Army to support Montgomery's Operation Market Garden. Patton protested vigorously, arguing that his advance should be prioritized. Eisenhower maintained his decision based on theater strategy. The fuel shortage slowed Third Army's advance for several weeks. German forces gained time to stabilize defensive lines in Lorraine. Some historians argue that decision extended the war by months. Others argue it was necessary for theater-level coordination. The debate continues. General Bradley, Patton's immediate superior, respected Patton's combat abilities but worried about his command discipline. Bradley's operational style emphasized systematic planning and coordination. Patton's style emphasized speed and accepting risk. The contrast created tension. Bradley sometimes felt Patton created problems for adjacent units by moving too fast and disrupting operational coordination. Patton felt Bradley's caution wasted opportunities. Both perspectives had merit. The optimal answer probably lay between their approaches. But in terms of destroying German combat power, Patton's approach was measurably more effective. The German perspective makes this clear. They did not fear Patton because he was reckless. They feared him because his methods worked. Speed created vulnerabilities, but speed also created advantages that outweighed the vulnerabilities. German commanders could exploit Patton's exposed flanks theoretically, but practically they could not execute the movements required before Patton's forces advanced beyond the threat. This became evident in the Battle of the Bulge. German planning for the Ardennes offensive specifically targeted the junction between Bradley's 12th Army Group and British forces, precisely because they assessed that area was not defended by Patton's Third Army. The offensive achieved surprise, created a significant penetration, and threatened Allied operational coherence. German forces made substantial gains in the first 72 hours. Then Patton counterattacked. The German advance stalled. Not because German forces lacked strength, but because Patton relieved Bastogne faster than German planning anticipated, changing the operational calculus before German forces could achieve their objectives. If another American commander had faced the same situation, the German assessment was that Bastogne would have fallen, the Meuse River crossings would have been threatened, and the Ardennes offensive might have achieved strategic results. Patton's speed prevented that outcome. After the Battle of the Bulge, German defensive strategy on the Western Front shifted. Previous strategy had attempted to trade space for time, preserving combat power through mobile defense. That strategy had failed against Patton repeatedly. New strategy emphasized static defense in fortified positions, attempting to slow Patton through defensive depth rather than mobile operations. The shift acknowledged that German mobile forces could not operate effectively against Third Army's operational tempo. Better to defend in place and force Patton to conduct time-consuming siege operations. The strategy had some success. Third Army's advance slowed when facing fortified cities like Metz, but the overall strategic effect was minimal. Static defense surrendered. Initiative completely. German forces could slow Patton, but they could not stop him. And once Third Army penetrated fortified zones, German forces lacked mobile reserves to counterattack, because those reserves had been committed to static defense. In March 1945, Third Army crossed the Rhine River at Oppenheim, south of Mainz. The Rhine represented the last major natural barrier protecting Germany. Crossing it meant the war was effectively over. Montgomery had been planning a massive set-piece operation, Operation Plunder, scheduled for March 23rd. The operation involved 4,000 artillery pieces, aerial bombardment, airborne assaults, and elaborate logistics preparation. Classic Montgomery. Methodical, overwhelming, guaranteed to succeed. Patton wanted to beat him across. On March 19th, Bradley told Patton to take the Rhine on the run. Patton had been preparing. His staff had positioned bridging equipment and assault boats in rear areas since the previous fall. On March 21st, Major General Manton Eddy, commanding 12th Corps, received orders to cross immediately. The 5th Infantry Division, commanded by Major General S. Leroy Irwin, was assigned the mission. The crossing site was Oppenheim, approximately 12 miles south of Mainz. Patton ordered a feint at Mainz to draw German attention while the real crossing happened at Oppenheim. The timing was extraordinarily compressed. Irwin was informed on March 21st that the crossing could happen that night. He protested that a well-planned and ordered crossing was impossible on such short notice, but he could get some sort of bridgehead. Patton said that was exactly what he wanted. Some sort of bridgehead was enough. The crossing began at 22:30 hours on March 22, 1945. The 11th Infantry Regiment led the assault. Soldiers crossed in assault boats under darkness. To their surprise, German resistance was minimal. The opposite bank was lightly defended. German forces had not expected a crossing at Oppenheim. Their attention was focused on Mainz and the northern sectors where Montgomery was preparing. By morning of March 23rd, 5th Division had established a solid bridgehead. Engineers began constructing pontoon bridges immediately. The 249th Engineer Combat Battalion completed a 366-meter floating bridge in 18 hours, a remarkable engineering accomplishment. By March 24th, armor and vehicles were crossing the Rhine in large numbers. Within 48 hours of the initial assault, Third Army had moved substantial combat power across the river and was advancing into southern Germany. Patton made certain the world knew about it. On March 23rd, he telephoned Bradley. "Brad, for God's sake, tell the world we're across. I want the world to know Third Army made it before Monty starts across." The next day, March 24th, Patton visited the pontoon bridge. Halfway across, he stopped, unzipped his fly, and urinated into the Rhine River. An Army photographer captured the moment. Patton later claimed he had been looking forward to that for a long time. When he reached the opposite bank, he deliberately stumbled and fell, grabbing 2 handfuls of German earth. He stood up and shouted, "Thus, William the Conqueror," imitating William's landing in England in 1066. That evening, Patton sent a message to Eisenhower. "Dear Schaeff, I have just pissed into the Rhine River. For God's sake, send some gasoline." The Rhine crossing epitomized everything about Patton that German commanders found impossible to counter. Minimal preparation time, accepting risk to achieve speed, crossing in an unexpected location, exploiting success immediately rather than consolidating, and generating operational momentum faster than German forces could react. Montgomery's Operation Plunder began on schedule on March 23rd. It was a magnificent operation, professionally executed with overwhelming force. But Patton had already crossed 24 hours earlier with a fraction of the resources Montgomery employed. The contrast was stark. Montgomery planned for weeks, assembled massive forces, executed a deliberate assault, and crossed successfully. Patton planned for hours, used what was immediately available, achieved surprise, and crossed successfully. Both methods worked, but Patton's method was faster. German forces opposing Third Army's Rhine crossing were fragments of Army Group G, commanded by General Feldmarschall Kesselring. The units defending the Oppenheim sector were under strength, poorly equipped, and positioned to defend against an assault at Mainz. When Third Army crossed at Oppenheim, German forces were caught out of position. Hitler ordered counterattacks to eliminate the bridgehead. Kesselring replied that no reserves were available. The German defensive system in the west had collapsed. Units were isolated, communications were disrupted, command and control was fragmenting. Patton's Rhine crossing exploited that collapse perfectly. He crossed where Germans were weakest, at a time when they could not respond, and exploited success faster than German forces could reorganize. Kesselring later acknowledged that Patton's Rhine crossing at Oppenheim was the most professionally executed river assault operation he witnessed in the entire war. Coming from a German field marshal who had commanded defensive operations across North Africa, Italy, and Western Europe, that assessment carried significant weight. The operation succeeded because it combined surprise, speed, and risk acceptance in ways that overwhelmed German defensive capabilities. Within 2 weeks of the crossing, Third Army moved more than 60,000 military vehicles across the Rhine. The operation was a key factor in ending the war in Europe, months ahead of Allied high command projections. Third Army's final advance through southern Germany in April and May 1945 demonstrated Patton's operational method at its peak. German forces were collapsing, command and control was fragmenting, supply systems were destroyed, but organized resistance remained in many sectors. Other Allied forces conducted deliberate advances, clearing sectors systematically. Patton's forces drove deep, bypassing resistance, seizing key terrain, cutting communications, and creating operational chaos in German rear areas. German unit commanders found themselves isolated, surrounded, unable to communicate with higher headquarters, and facing American forces they had not known were approaching. Surrender rates in sectors facing Third Army were significantly higher than in other sectors, not because German soldiers were less motivated, but because the operational situation made continued resistance tactically meaningless. The final casualty statistics reflected Patton's impact. Third Army captured or destroyed more German combat power per day of operations than any other Allied field army in Europe. From August 1944 to May 1945, Third Army advanced further, captured more prisoners, seized more territory, and inflicted higher rates of German force disintegration than comparable Allied formations. The numbers were not close. Third Army's operational effectiveness exceeded other armies by substantial margins. German military professionals recognized this. After the war, the United States Army conducted extensive interviews with captured German officers, documenting their assessments of Allied commanders and operations. The interviews were systematic, covering hundreds of officers from battalion commanders to field marshals. The consistent theme regarding Patton was fear based on effectiveness. German officers respected Montgomery's professionalism, acknowledged Bradley's competence, but feared Patton's speed. General Major Friedrich von Mellenthin, operations officer for multiple panzer armies, wrote extensively about operations against Patton in his post-war memoir Panzer Battles. Von Mellenthin had fought across North Africa, Russia, and Western Europe. He had direct experience with armored operations at corps and army level. His analysis emphasized that Patton understood that modern mobile warfare was fundamentally about tempo. The side that operated inside the opponent's decision cycle won regardless of tactical details. Patton operated consistently inside German decision cycles, creating situations where German forces reacted to events rather than executing planned operations. Reaction mode led to defensive collapse. General der Panzertruppen, Hasso von Manteuffel, who commanded the 5th Panzer Army in the Ardennes offensive, provided insights about facing Patton during post-war interrogations. Von Manteuffel noted the irony that German forces faced an opponent who applied blitzkrieg principles more effectively than German commanders could in 1944 and 1945. German doctrine had emphasized speed, surprise, and dislocation since the 1930s. Patton used those same principles, but with advantages German commanders lacked. He had better logistics, better intelligence, and more operational freedom than German commanders operating under Hitler's increasingly restrictive control. By late 1944, German operations were constrained by fuel shortages, Allied air superiority, and Hitler's no-retreat orders. Patton faced logistical challenges, but operated in an environment where his superiors allowed him operational freedom. That freedom, combined with his aggressive personality, created an opponent German forces could not effectively counter. The historical assessment has remained consistent. Military historians, analyzing the European campaign, rate Patton as the most effective Allied operational commander, based on measurable outcomes. Some historians note his flaws. He created coordination problems, strained logistics, and his personal behavior was often problematic. These criticisms are valid, but the fundamental question is which Allied commander most effectively destroyed German combat power. By that measure, Patton exceeded his peers substantially. German commanders' fear of him was rational, based on repeated experience of his methods defeating their defensive operations. Patton died in December 1945 from injuries sustained in a vehicle accident in Germany. He was 60 years old. His death occurred months after Germany's surrender, but while he was still commanding Third Army during occupation duties. German officers who had fought against him learned of his death. Some noted it privately with something approaching relief. The opponent they had feared was gone. General der Panzertruppen Heinrich von Lüttwitz was interviewed after the war as part of the United States Army's historical documentation project. He was asked to assess Allied commanders he had faced. He discussed Montgomery's professionalism, Bradley's systematic approach, and other commanders' various strengths. Regarding Patton, von Lüttwitz's assessment focused on operational tempo. Patton understood that war was about creating chaos in the enemy's operations, while maintaining coherence in your own. Patton created chaos through speed. German forces defending against him spent their time reacting, repositioning, trying to understand what was happening. That constant reaction prevented effective defense. Von Lüttwitz's analysis noted that if the Allies had fielded multiple commanders with Patton's operational tempo, the war would have ended months earlier. German defensive strategy depended on time. Time to reposition forces, time to prepare defenses, time to organize counterattacks. Patton did not give that time. That was the fundamental reason German generals found him so difficult to counter. The historical record supports this conclusion. Third Army's operational achievements exceeded other Allied formations by substantial margins. German forces facing Third Army suffered disproportionate casualties, encirclements, and operational disintegration. The cause was not better equipment, not numerical superiority, but operational tempo that German defensive doctrine could not counter. Patton's legacy in military history rests on this reality. He demonstrated that speed and aggressiveness, applied systematically at operational scale, could defeat defensive forces through dislocation rather than firepower. That lesson influenced post-war American military doctrine significantly. The concept of operational tempo, of moving inside enemy decision cycles, became central to United States Army operational planning. The doctrine traces directly to Patton's demonstrated effectiveness in World War II. German military professionals studied Patton's methods after the war. The Bundeswehr, established in 1955, incorporated analysis of Allied operations into its doctrinal development. Patton's campaigns were studied extensively because they demonstrated how mobile warfare could defeat defensive operations, even when the defender held good terrain and prepared positions. The lesson was clear. Defensive success required either matching the attacker's operational tempo or possessing such overwhelming defensive strength that tempo became irrelevant. German forces in 1944 and 1945 had neither advantage when facing Patton. The result was operational defeat, even when German forces fought effectively at tactical level. That combination of tactical competence and operational defeat characterized German forces facing Third Army throughout the Northwest Europe campaign. German soldiers fought hard. German officers executed sound tactics. German defensive positions were professionally constructed. None of it mattered when Patton's operational tempo prevented those advantages from being employed effectively. The fear German generals felt was not fear of individual battles, but fear of operational irrelevance. Fear that their professional expertise, their tactical skill, their defensive preparations would become meaningless because Patton moved too fast for any of it to matter. That fear was realized repeatedly from Sicily to southern Germany. It made Patton the Allied commander German generals feared most. Not the most skilled, not the most careful, but the most dangerous because his methods worked and German doctrine had no effective counter.